That was the singular, agonizing detail Arya knew she would carry to her grave. It wasn't the cruel mockery of the Iron Veil Pack's laughter, nor the suffocating heat of the ceremonial hall, nor the way the low afternoon sun bled through the heavy stable doors like a bleeding wound. She had only paused outside the side entrance to catch a desperate breath before she was forced to walk down that aisle, destined to surrender her life forever. But the oak door was unlatched. Through the narrow crack, Ronan's arrogant voice carried with brutal clarity.
I care nothing for whether she is my fated mate or an inferior, broken entity. The entitled beta sneered, his tone as casual as a man discussing the autumn harvest. She is a crippled Omega. The moment my mark burns into her flesh, she becomes my property. She will submit, or I will break what little remains of her. That is how the hierarchy works. The world fractured. Arya stood frozen for 4 agonizing seconds, her breath catching in her throat. Then she fled. There was no calculation, no destination, no logic. Her mangled leg dragged slightly, a cruel reminder of the abuse she had endured from her toxic pack, but adrenaline masked the agony. She bolted through the shadows of the rear stone corridor, burst into the dim stables, and hurled her fragile body onto the nearest beast. It was an immense black stallion. By every law of nature, temperament, and sheer dominance, the massive predator should have reared and crushed her skull instantly. Instead, the stallion let out a low, knowing snort and ran. She did not discover the terrifying identity of the stallion's true master until 3 days later. By then, Alpha King Theron was already hunting her. And the legendary ruler was not dispatching his royal enforcers. He was tracking her himself. The forest blurred into chaotic streaks of black and gray. Sharp pine branches clawed at Arya's face, tearing the delicate lace from her hair. The white hem of her ceremonial dress was instantly ruined, shredded by brambles and caked in dark mud, catching the wind behind her like a tattered flag of surrender. She should have been paralyzed by terror. She was. Yet, beneath the suffocating fear, a strange, long-buried sensation bloomed, something that felt dangerously like freedom. She hadn't breathed without fear in months. The stallion ran with an eerie, unyielding purpose. That was the first detail that unsettled her. She had gripped the leather reins, expecting a violent struggle, prepared to force the beast to obey her commands. But the stallion possessed an iron will of his own. Every time she attempted to yank the reins left toward familiar borders, the horse corrected his trajectory without a single moment of hesitation. Every time her exhausted hands grew weak, the stallion accelerated, his thundering hooves shaking the earth. He was not her mount. He was her guide, and she was merely surviving the ride. "Fine," Arya whispered into the biting wind, her voice trembling. "Have your way." She ceased her futile struggle against him. The night stretched into a vast, moonless abyss. She lost all perception of time within the first hour. She lost all sense of direction by the second. By the third hour of the grueling flight, Arya accepted that she was completely, irreversibly lost within the treacherous wilderness, a fact that seemed to trouble the majestic horse not at all. To keep her fragile sanity intact, she began to speak to him. She spoke of the wilted wildflowers the pack had forced into her hair that morning. She spoke of how her abusive mother had pressed the heavy white fabric into her trembling hands with hard, unyielding eyes. She spoke of the sickening, possessive smile Ronan had worn at the pre-ceremony gathering. The smug look of a cruel conqueror claiming a piece of property he had already paid for. The stallion's ears flicked back, listening to her ragged confessions with an uncanny, silent intelligence. Dawn crawled across the horizon, a bleak, freezing gray that filtered through the ancient pine canopy in thin, ghostly spears of light. Arya's body was a map of agony. Her arms throbbed. Her spine ached, and her disabled leg was completely numb from being pressed against the stallion's massive, muscular flanks for hours. Suddenly, the dense thicket began to thin, and the sharp rush of moving water echoed through the trees. The stallion slowed his pace to a majestic, deliberate walk. A fast-running creek appeared ahead, its crystalline water rushing over smooth stones at the absolute edge of the territory she had known. The stallion approached the bank, lowering his massive head to drink with the calm authority of a creature that had flawlessly executed a mandate. Arya slid from his back, her weak leg giving out beneath her as she collapsed onto the damp earth. She sat there, panting, staring at the running water, desperate to escape the terrifying reality of her actions. Then, the heavy creak of wooden wheels shattered the silence. A canvas-covered cart emerged from the fog on the opposite side of the creek, a seasoned traveling merchant's rig pulled by two weary brown mares. The driver was a weathered, observant old wanderer named Barrett. He possessed the hard, squinting eyes of a man who had survived decades on the dangerous border roads. Barrett brought his mares to a sudden halt. His gaze drifted from Arya's tattered white dress to the magnificent black stallion beside her. Slowly, the color drained from the old man's face, leaving him pale as a ghost. He laid down his leather reins with the excruciating care of someone who had just realized he was standing in the presence of a sleeping monster. "Girl," Barrett called out, his voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "Where in the name of the ancestors did you claim that beast?" Arya forced herself to sit upright, clutching her ruined gown. The stables at the Ironvale settlement. I was escaping. I needed a mount, and he didn't throw me. Why? What is wrong? Barrett remained silent for a long, agonizing moment. He stared at the stallion's flawless, powerful lines, the deep midnight black coat, and the arrogant, noble posture of the animal. "That," Barrett said, each word heavy with dread, "is Shadow." The name meant nothing to her. Arya simply waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That is the Alpha King's personal stallion," Barrett revealed, his voice shaking. "Shadow belongs to King Theron. He is renowned across every northern territory. There is not another creature like him in the mortal realms. Every lichen from here to the mountain peaks knows his silhouette on sight." The creek continued its indifferent rush. Arya turned her head slowly to look at the beast. Shadow lifted his massive head from the water, his deep, dark eyes locking onto hers with an ancient, terrifying intelligence. It wasn't her imagination. The horse had stood perfectly still for her. He had run without hesitation.
He had guided her directly to this royal border with absolute calculating intent.
He let me ride him, Arya whispered, the realization crushing the breath from her lungs.
Yes, Barrett muttered darkly, clicking his tongue to urge his mares forward. And that is your greatest peril.
The Alpha King's horse accepts no one but the king himself. If you are riding him, the entire northern vanguard will be hunting you. I want no part of this.
The old merchant guided his cart quickly around the bend of the creek, leaving Arya entirely alone in the gray morning light. Terrified, she made the only logical choice left to her. She had to find the king. She had to return Shadow before his executioners found her. Chapter 2: The Sovereign's Judgment. The great throne room of Blackwood Keep was architecturally designed to harvest silence. The dark stone walls were 4 feet thick. The towering vaulted ceilings swallowed every echo, and the iron torches burned without a single flicker. It was a fortress built to make regular men feel utterly insignificant, and it executed that task flawlessly. The royal scout, standing in the center of the hall, looked as though he were awaiting his own execution. He had ridden through the night. Mud caked his boots, and a deep, hollow exhaustion cast dark shadows beneath his eyes. He had already delivered his unbelievable report to the outer sentinels and to the second-in-command. And each time he had been met with the same stunned disbelief. Now he stood before the terrifying presence of Alpha King Theron. Shadow carried her willingly. "My Alpha," the scout stammered, bowing his head low. Out of the Iron Veil territory, through the dark. She did not force him. The stallion chose to take her. The silence that followed was suffocating. King Theron sat at the head of the massive obsidian council table, one scarred hand resting flat against the polished surface. He was a colossal, battle-hardened ruler, built by decades of brutal warfare and heavy crown responsibilities. A silver scar traced his jawline, a testament to past victories. He was a sovereign who had long since ceased to be surprised by the cruelties of the world, but this report caught him entirely off guard. His war council erupted into a frenzy of outrage. 3 senior Lycan elders began shouting simultaneously, demanding immediate retribution. "The royal enforcers," one roared. "A formal complaint must be levied against the Iron Veil elders. Execution for the thief!" Theron let them vent their fury. When the room finally fell quiet, he stood up, his towering frame casting a massive shadow across the chamber. "I will ride out alone," Theron commanded, his deep baritone cutting through the tension. His second-in-command, Drav, a broad, battle-scarred veteran wolf who had served faithfully at Theron's right hand for 11 years, stepped forward in open protest. "Your Majesty, this is a severe misallocation of your royal presence. It is beneath the Alpha King to track a common horse thief. Let my vanguards handle this." Theron turned his piercing golden alpha eyes toward his commander. The stallion chose her, Drav. Those 5 words carried the weight of an absolute decree. Drav immediately closed his mouth, bowing his head. "I obey, my Alpha." "Prepare a minimal escort," Theron ordered, his dark leather royal cape swirling as he turned. "We ride within the hour." As the council scrambled to obey, Theron's mind raced.
In 15 years, Shadow had violently rejected every rider who dared approach him. Foreign alphas, decorated warlords, and royal commanders alike. The stallion was an animal of absolute, unyielding decision. And he had decided that only one person in the entire world was worthy of his back. Until last night. Theron rode out into the freezing rain, telling himself it was merely a matter of security, though a strange, unfamiliar curiosity burned hot in his chest. Chapter 3. The Edge of the Abyss.
2 territories to the east, Arya had completely abandoned any attempt to steer the magnificent stallion.
Her disabled leg throbbed with a burning, relentless agony, and utter exhaustion had broken her spirit. For hours, she had tried to guide Shadow toward what she assumed was the royal Blackwood territory. But the horse had simply ignored her commands, redirecting their course with a quiet, maddening confidence. "You are taking me exactly where you want to go, aren't you?" Arya murmured, her voice sounding fragile against the ancient, towering pines. Shadow flicked his ears, but did not slow his steady pace. The air grew rapidly colder, sharper, carrying the distinct scent of high altitude. Arya pulled the tattered, mud-stained white fabric of her gown tighter around her shivering shoulders. She had a terrifying, sinking premonition. Shadow was not taking her to find the king. The stallion was delivering her to the exact location where the Alpha King would harvest her. And behind her, closing the distance with terrifying speed, Theron tracked the path of his legendary steed. Through 3 days of hard riding, Theron had constructed a specific profile of the thief in his mind. He had expected a calculating werewolf take. Highly trained operative, someone exceptionally bold or dangerously desperate, who knew the immense political value of the royal stallion. He had prepared himself to confront a ruthless adversary. He was entirely unprepared for the reality. Arya was sitting on a moss-covered log at the absolute edge of a jagged ravine, her ruined, mud-caked wedding dress wrapped tightly around her shivering, frail frame. Her hands were raised to her tangled hair, her fingers trembling as she attempted to weave the remaining strands away from her face. She was losing the battle against the knots, tears of sheer frustration and physical exhaustion welling in her eyes. Shadow stood directly beside her, his massive, terrifying head resting gently against her frail shoulder. The predatory stallion was comforting her with the deep, familiar ease of a creature that had protected her for a lifetime. Theron raised a hand, halting Drav and the royal escort at the tree line. "Stay back," the king commanded quietly, dismounting his steed and advancing into the clearing alone. The snap of a twig shattered the silence. Arya's head snapped up, her hands dropping from her hair as she forced herself to her feet. Her weak leg buckled slightly, but she caught her balance against Shadow's flank. When her eyes locked onto Theron's towering form, his royal leather vestments, and the undeniable aura of supreme dominance radiating from him, absolute terror drained the remaining warmth from her face. But she did not beg for her life, nor did she attempt to flee into the ravine. Instead, she grabbed Shadow's reins, dragged her disabled leg forward, and held them out to the king with trembling hands. "I am deeply sorry, Your Majesty," Arya gasped, her voice shaking but resolute. "I know there is no defense for my crime. I took your stallion without permission, but I swear to you I took the utmost care of him. He was never harmed.
I have spent the last 48 hours trying to find your keep to return him, but he refused to obey my steering. I know that sounds like a pathetic lie to escape your wrath, but I promise you. Silence, Theron commanded softly. Arya froze, her breath catching. Theron stepped closer, his golden eyes sweeping over her form, instantly identifying the truth of her condition. The white gown was a shredded, tragic rag, ruined by mud and briars. A dark bruise was visible on her collarbone, and her fragile body was trembling violently from hypothermia and fear. Yet she held the leather reins out to him with absolute, unwavering accountability. Theron did not take the reins. Are you injured, little wolf? Arya blinked, utterly stunned by the question. No, Your Majesty. I am unhurt. Then, driven by a strange, selfless instinct, she knelt down on her good knee, her hands gently checking Shadow's forelegs and hooves. He is not injured either. I ensured we rested after the initial flight, and I found clean water for him twice. I did not abuse him, I swear. You harbor more concern for my stallion than for your own life, Theron observed, his voice softening. Arya stood up with great difficulty, looking directly into the Alpha King's eyes. You love him, Your Majesty. I could not bear the thought of a magnificent creature suffering because of my desperation. Shadow nudged Arya's shoulder, completely ignoring his master of 15 years. Theron watched the interaction with profound disbelief. What were you fleeing from, child? Theron questioned, his tone commanding, yet oddly gentle. Arya looked down at the damp earth, the painful memories flooding back. In quiet, unembellished words, she revealed the horrific reality of her existence within the Iron Veil Pack. The constant abuse she endured as a disabled Omega, the forced arrangement to the cruel Beta, and the devastating words she had overheard through the cracked door. She spoke of Ronan's vow to treat her as nothing more than a broken possession to be claimed and dominated. She did not beg for pity. She stated the facts of her trauma with a hollow, heartbreaking clarity. When she finished her tale, she braced herself for his judgment. Theron stared at the fragile, unbreakable woman before him. He had expected a calculating thief. Instead, he had found a brave, abused wolf who had seized her one chance at survival and spent the aftermath ensuring the safety of a horse. She had not once used the word belong to describe herself, rejecting the very concept of ownership. A profound, ancient protective instinct flared to life within the Alpha King's chest. He made a decision that defied all political logic. You will ride with me under royal protection, Theron declared, his voice echoing through the ravine. Until you decide what path your own free will desires. Chapter 4. The Royal Sanctuary. Theron delivered the terms of his protection clearly, his voice devoid of false promises. She would journey with the royal vanguard to Blackwood Keep. She would be granted sanctuary, proper nourishment, and the full protection of the crown. He would not contact the Iron Veil elders, nor would he permit Ronan to ever lay a hand on her. In return, he demanded absolute honesty. Arya listened intently, her eyes wide with skepticism. Why, Your Majesty? You do not know me.
I am a broken, crippled Omega who stole your most prized possession. You could hand me over to my pack and settle this matter instantly. Why protect me?" Theron glanced back at Drav and his enforcers, who were watching the exchange with stunned silence. Then he looked back at Arya. "Because no innocent soul deserves to be returned to a cage, and I do not pass judgment without understanding the full truth." Arya studied the massive king, a fragile glimmer of hope reflecting in her eyes, though her defensive walls remained high. "I accept your terms, my alpha." That evening, the royal vanguard established a camp in a secluded clearing surrounded by towering stone cliffs. The soldiers moved with flawless efficiency, building a roaring fire and setting up camp. Arya stood on the absolute periphery, clutching her arms, visibly terrified of the massive warriors surrounding her. She had been given clean, warm leather traveling clothes from the vanguard's supplies. The tattered white ceremonial dress was gone, folded away into a saddlebag without a single shred of sentiment. Theron purposely kept his distance, eating with his men and discussing their return route with Drav, allowing the traumatized girl space to find her footing. Yet, every time a soldier approached her to offer food or water, Arya went entirely rigid, her eyes darting toward the tree line, calculating escape routes. She was terrified of the absolute authority they possessed over her fate. Her only comfort was Shadow. The massive stallion refused to go to the picket line with the other vanguard's mounts. Instead, the horse positioned his colossal body directly behind Arya, acting as an unyielding, living shield against the rest of the camp. When Drav attempted to lead him away, Shadow let out a menacing warning growl. Theron caught Drav's eye and shook his head. "Leave him." As the fire burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone cliffs, Arya finally looked across the flames at the king. Her hands gripped her tin cup tightly. "Why did he choose me, your majesty?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "You said he has never carried another soul in 15 years. Why did he save a broken Omega? I did nothing to earn his loyalty." "It makes no sense." Theron stared into the dying fire, his golden eyes reflecting the flames. "Perhaps, little wolf, Shadow recognized something that my warriors could not. He recognized a spirit that refuses to be broken, no matter how heavy the chains." Theron was a ruler who rarely found himself at a loss for words, nor was he a man accustomed to confessing the boundaries of his own comprehension. Whether presiding over the High Council, navigating treacherous territorial treaties, or managing the countless daily disputes where a monarch's absolute certainty served as the iron anchor of peace, he maintained an unshakable facade. Yet, looking across the dying embers of the campfire at the young woman before him, that iron facade cracked ever so slightly. "I do not have an answer for you," he admitted, his voice low and raspy. Arya shifted her gaze from the glowing coals to look directly at him. Her fingers tightened around the worn tin cup, drawing warmth from the meager tea inside. Theron continued to stare into the fading fire, the golden glint of his lichen eyes mirroring the dancing flames. "I have raised Shadow for 9 winters. I understand his volatile nature better than I understand the temperaments of most lords in my court. What he did at the Iron Veil stables, how he chose you, How he submitted to you is an anomaly.
I cannot explain it through logic or training.
He paused, the heavy silence of the northern wilderness wrapping around their small camp. And that uncertainty troubles me deeply, Theron added.
Arya remained quiet, but a subtle change passed over her posture. The defensive tightness in her shoulders, a burden she had carried so habitually that she likely no longer recognized its weight, began to dissolve. It was an almost imperceptible release, like a tightly wound knot finally yielding after years of neglect. She looked back down at the embers, her expression softening. "Very well," she murmured. The words were not entirely directed at the Alpha King. They felt more like a quiet pact she was forging with herself.
An acceptance of the strange path she was now walking. Theron observed her from the shadows across the hearth, offering no further commentary.
He had spoken the absolute truth. He truly did not comprehend why the ancient, stubborn stallion had chosen to protect a vulnerable, rejected Omega. But as the cold night wind howled through the pine needles above, Theron began to realize that finding the answer to that question mattered infinitely more than the mere recovery of his royal beast. The emotional walls Arya had erected around herself did not crumble overnight. Such fortifications, built over a lifetime of cruelty and rejection within the Iron Veil Pack, were not dismantled by a single moment of kindness. Instead, they began to thaw slowly, the way winter frost gradually recedes from a window pane when a steady warmth is introduced to the room.
On their first morning on the trail, Arya had eaten her rations with her back partially turned toward the royal guard.
Her shoulders angled protectively toward Shadow, keeping her words to an absolute minimum. By the second morning, she no longer flinched when one of the battle-hardened soldiers stepped near her to offer a fresh plate. By the fourth day of the journey, she was sitting fully within the inner circle of the campfire, sharing the warmth of the flames without fear. Theron noted each minute adjustment, the way he noted everything in his territory, quietly, meticulously, without drawing any unnecessary attention to her progress. His royal escort noticed the transformation as well, though they maintained a respectful silence. They were elite warriors, fiercely loyal to the crown, and they understood the unspoken commands of their king. The true shift in their dynamic arrived without any grand announcement. They were navigating a suffocatingly dense corridor of ancient pines, a narrow trail that forced the riders into a single-file line. The towering trees muffled the sounds of the forest, making conversation nearly impossible unless one raised their voice against the wind. Theron, leading the party, had been navigating purely by memory. Trusting a familiar landmark, he made a minor miscalculation at a hidden fork in the path, adding an unnecessary quarter of a mile to their trek before recognizing the error and quietly correcting his course. Arya, riding Shadow directly behind the king's massive warhorse, remained silent for a few paces before speaking up. "You took the wrong turn back there, my alpha," she said clearly. Theron kept his eyes fixed firmly on the rugged trail ahead. "I adjusted our heading," he replied smoothly. "You bore left at the ridgeline," Arya countered, her voice carrying a newfound confidence. "The rushing sounds of the border creek have been echoing from our right side since dawn. That means we have been tracking strictly northeast. Turning left pushed us further into the northern valley when we should have been cutting west toward the main pass." A heavy silence descended upon the path. Theron pulled the reins,
slowing his mount to a steady walk.
"You have been tracking the acoustic resonance of the river," he observed. "I have been paying attention to every single detail," Arya stated, her tone firm yet respectful.
"I am trapped in a completely unfamiliar territory, surrounded by elite warriors I do not know." "Of course I am keeping track of our position, Your Majesty."
Theron considered her words. It was a thoroughly logical, entirely correct assessment. He had, in fact, miscalculated the turn.
"You are entirely right," Theron conceded. He heard the subtle shift of leather behind him as Arya adjusted her weight in the saddle.
It was the physical reaction of someone who had braced herself for a harsh reprimand, only to receive complete validation instead.
She seemed momentarily unsure of how to process the lack of conflict. They rode onward in silence for another league.
"Most individuals within my court do not possess the courage to inform me when I am mistaken," Theron noted quietly.
"They are usually far too terrified of the consequences."
"And you believe I am not afraid?" Arya asked, a slight beat passing between them.
"I am actually quite terrified," she admitted softly. "I simply decided that keeping us on the correct path was worth the risk of your anger." Theron made no verbal reply, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward in a manner that would have utterly confounded the High Council back at Blackwood Keep. 2 days later, the silence between them broke completely when she laughed. They had paused at midday near a wide, sun-drenched granite slab to let the horses rest. Theron, while delivering a completely dry, the deep, resonant voice of an awkwardly romantic trade dispute he had arbitrated the previous winter involving 2 stubborn pack elders, a disputed boundary stone, and a single goat that both parties claimed as vital evidence, delivered the climax of the tale with such absolute solemnity that it took Arya several seconds to realize he was practicing humor. When the realization struck, she let out a genuine, melodic laugh, the kind of pure amusement that bursts forth before the mind can censor it. Immediately realizing what she had done, Arya clapped her hand over her mouth, her eyes widening in sudden apprehension. Theron turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. "Why do you hide your joy?" he asked. "What did you think would happen?" Arya lowered her hand slowly, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I do not know, Your Majesty. Nothing, I suppose. I just—" She paused, deciding that absolute honesty was the safest route with the king. "Everyone in the Southern Territory speaks of the Alpha King as if he were carved from monolithic stone, entirely devoid of a soul or a sense of humor." "I am well aware of that reputation," Theron replied. "You could easily correct that terrifying impression if you wished," she suggested. "I find the terror highly utilitarian," Theron said, his voice remaining flat. "Pack masters and corrupt lords are significantly more efficient when they are deeply uncomfortable in my presence. It ensures council meetings conclude much faster." Arya stared at him, her eyes bright. "That might be the most calculatingly intimidating philosophy I have ever heard," she remarked. "And you speak of it as if it were a perfectly ordinary method of governance." "It is entirely reasonable," Theron countered. "It is." Arya pressed her lips together, her entire face straining as she fought against another wave of laughter. "It is a little bit monstrous, my Alpha." "Indeed," Theron murmured, returning his attention to his traveling rations. Arya laughed again,
softer this time, and she did not attempt to cover her face. After that afternoon, an unspoken bond formed between them, a comfortable ease that defied the rigid hierarchy of their ranks.
She began to speak to the Alpha King with a direct, inquisitive nature,
entirely stripping away the rehearsed subservience she had been forced to practice since childhood.
She questioned him extensively about the architecture of Blackwood Keep, the legal intricacies of the Northern Territory boundaries,
and how the Royal Pack Council operated at a regional level compared to the localized rule of Pack Alphas.
Theron discovered that beneath her fragile Omega exterior lay a sharp, highly analytical intelligence.
She possessed an innate understanding of structural power dynamics. Who held the true leverage?
How resources moved through a territory, and how decrees were actually executed versus how they were written on parchment. She had simply spent her entire life in an abusive environment that actively suppressed her intellect.
When he inquired where she had acquired her remarkable ability to read the terrain, Arya explained that the wilderness had been her only sanctuary.
"I taught myself out of necessity," she stated plainly, without a hint of self-pity. "I spent my childhood hiding in the deep forests because the open woods were far kinder than the halls of the Iron Vale settlement." She moved past the statement quickly, shifting the conversation before he could probe deeper into her trauma.
Theron allowed her to change the subject, but he captured that fragment of her past, locking it away in his mind to ponder later.
Arya continued to share pieces of her soul without consciously realizing she was doing so.
She revealed the quiet tragedies of a life spent entirely in the service of other people's comfort, a history defined by making herself small, speaking in whispers and retreating into the shadows whenever she felt her mere presence was an inconvenience to the pack.
She offered these heartbreaking details casually, appending them to her stories like minor footnotes.
Theron collected every single word.
He spoke very little of his own history, as was his custom,
but he listened to her with an intensity he had not granted to any living soul in over a decade.
It was a complete, unhurried, and genuinely captivated attention that had absolutely nothing to do with royal strategy or political maneuvering.
Deep within his chest, Theron's lichen wolf grew increasingly restless.
The beast was alert, warm, and constantly straining toward Arya, reaching for a connection that lay just beyond the king's current understanding. Theron noted the internal friction, dismissing it as a natural protective instinct triggered by the highly irregular circumstances of their journey. He refused to look any closer at the swelling emotion. Not yet. The Imperial Way Station was situated at the crossroads of two major trade routes in the mid-northern territory. Constructed from heavy, reinforced river stone, the fortress-like building was permanently garrisoned by royal sentries and served as a neutral sanctuary for traveling wolves, merchants, and pack dignitaries. By ancient decree, all ancestral rivalries and pack disputes were strictly forbidden within its walls, set aside in favor of survival and commerce. Ronan understood nothing of ancient honor. The arrogant beta antagonist arrived in the late afternoon, leading a squadron of 6 heavily armed Iron Vale wolves. A foul, toxic rage clung to Ronan, an anger that had festered over days of relentless tracking, curdling into a dangerous, volatile malice. It was the frantic fury of an entitled man whose absolute reality had been publicly shattered. Ronan had stood before his entire pack assembly, watching his submissive, disabled Omega bride walk out of their sacred wedding ceremony. Since that humiliating hour, the whispers and mocking glances of his packmates had driven him to the brink of madness. He rode his foaming mount directly into the cobblestone courtyard of the way station, his eyes scanning the space until they locked onto his targets. Farron was standing near the far edge of the yard, quietly conversing with the Imperial station keeper. Arya was only a few paces away, adjusting Shadow's bridle. The massive black stallion standing protectively at her shoulder, as had become his permanent habit. Several of Theron's royal guards were stationed loosely around the perimeter, their postures seemingly relaxed. Yet their hands hovered instinctively near the hilts of their longswords. Ronan dismounted before his horse had even come to a complete halt. "There she is!" Ronan's voice boomed across the crowded courtyard, laced with the practiced authority of a wolf accustomed to enforcing his will. The casual chatter within the yard instantly died. Heads turned toward the commotion. A group of local merchants near the main entrance froze, sensing the immediate danger. Ronan marched directly toward the Alpha King, an act that was either born of absolute stupidity or a complete inability to comprehend the lethal reality of the situation. Theron turned slowly away from the station keeper, his golden eyes locking onto the approaching Beta. His expression remained a terrifying void, entirely devoid of emotion. "You stole what belongs to me," Ronan snarled, stopping a mere 10 feet from the king. His jaw was clenched so tightly the muscles strained, his eyes burning with malice. "She was promised to me under a binding pack alliance. You unlawfully removed an Iron Veil citizen from our ancestral lands. That is a direct violation of territorial law, and I am here to claim my property and take her home." The entire courtyard became deathly silent. Theron did not offer a defensive retort, nor did his posture shift into a combative stance. He simply looked down at Ronan with the absolute stillness of an apex predator measuring a lesser creature and finding it utterly insignificant. There was no anger in the king's gaze, no outrage, only a cold, patient assessment that felt infinitely more terrifying than an outright threat. Ronan's eyes flickered past the king, landing squarely on Arya. "Gather your things," he commanded, his voice dropping into a low, possessive rumble that offered no room for refusal. "We are returning to the settlement immediately. We will discuss the severe consequences of your rebellion once we are home." That was the exact crystalline moment. In the quiet hours that followed, Theron would replay the sequence of events in his mind, the precise fraction of a second where he had begun to draw breath, preparing to speak the absolute words of royal law that would strip Ronan of his delusions. The king had the legal decrees memorized. His absolute authority to execute the Beta on the spot for disrespecting the crown was unquestioned. But Theron never received the chance to speak. Arya stepped forward. She did not retreat behind the king's massive frame, nor did she cower. She stepped directly into the center of the conflict, claiming her own space. Beside her, Shadow lifted his massive head, a low, guttural warning vibrating in his powerful chest before he went completely still. His intelligent eyes locked onto Ronan. "I left of my own free will," Arya stated. Her voice was shaking, a visible, audible tremor that she could not hide, yet she forced the words out with an iron resolve that stunned the onlookers.
I was not abducted by the king. I was not confused by fear, nor was I manipulated by anyone.
She held Ronan's furious gaze, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of looking away.
I overheard your cruel words in the pavilion before the ceremony commenced.
I heard you tell your commanders that my consent did not matter. I heard you declare that because I am a disabled Omega, I would simply become your mindless possession the moment your teeth sank into my neck to form the mate bond. She took a steadying breath, her posture straightening. I heard your true intentions, Ronan, and I chose to run. I chose my own survival. That was my choice, and mine alone. The courtyard remained entirely breathless. Ronan's expression contorted, the blind fury temporarily short-circuiting as a deep shock fractured his arrogance. He looked at Arya as if she were a ghost, as if a silent, compliant object he had owned for years had suddenly stood upright and spoken to him in a language he could not comprehend.
You do not possess the mental clarity to understand what you are saying, Ronan claimed, his voice dropping into a forced,
the controlled tone of artificial reason. You were terrified by the scale of the wedding. You made a reckless decision under immense emotional duress, and the northern cold has clouded your mind. Come back with me. I comprehend the reality of my situation with absolute clarity, Arya interrupted him, her voice slicing through his manipulation. Talia. Ronan used her old, discarded name, his tone mimicking a gentle, caring mate. You have an established life at the southern settlement. You have family and people who care for your well-being. What you are doing right now, standing in a public sanctuary before complete strangers, hurling these treasonous accusations against your pack, this is not who you are. You have absolutely no concept of who I am, Arya whispered, her voice devoid of hatred, carrying only a profound, freezing finality. Because you never possessed the decency to ask. The words landed like a physical blow. Theron saw the subtle flicker in Ronan's eyes, not the dawning of genuine remorse, but the first terrifying realization that his absolute control over her had evaporated. The beta looked momentarily lost, his mind scrambling to find a legal or physical leverage he could exploit before his pride reassembled. Pack loyalty and ancestral laws require your return, Ronan began, trying to appeal to the surrounding witnesses. My loyalty does not require me to surrender my body and soul to a tyrant who views me as a piece of livestock, Arya declared calmly. I am never returning to your territory. That is my absolute final answer. It does not require your permission, nor does it require your acceptance. Defeated by her absolute lack of fear, Ronan turned his desperate gaze back to Theron. The Alpha King simply stared back at him, his silence a crushing weight. Whatever calculation Ronan ran in his mind, whatever assessment of the royal guard standing around him, he arrived at the only logical conclusion available to save his life. He was standing on imperial ground. He had launched a public, aggressive accusation, and it had been completely, systematically dismantled, not by the authority of the monarch, but by the very Omega he had come to enslave. Without uttering another syllable, Ronan spun on his heel, motioning sharply to his elite wolves. He marched back to his mount, threw himself into the saddle, and spurred the beast into a frantic gallop. He did not look back at Arya a single time. The courtyard remained locked in a stunned silence until the rhythmic pounding of the fleeing hooves completely faded down the eastern trail. Slowly, the natural rhythm of the way station resumed its course. The merchants returned to their trade, the station keeper hurried back to his duties, and the royal guards relaxed their grip on their weapons. Theron turned his gaze back to Arya. She was still standing in the exact center of the yard, her hands hanging loosely at her sides, her eyes fixed on the empty gate through which her past had just retreated. Her breathing was slow, deep, and meticulously controlled, the deliberate effort of a survivor processing a monumental victory. The expression on the Alpha King's face in that quiet moment was entirely unfamiliar to his men. They had seen him victorious after bloody campaigns. They had seen him unyielding during brutal treaties. But they had never seen him look at a human being with such profound, unmasked reverence, as if an ancient, a long-forgotten vault within his soul had quietly, irrevocably swung open. A profound metamorphosis had taken root within Arya. It was not an aggressive or dramatic display, but rather a quiet, undeniable restructuring of her entire being, visible only in the smallest details of her daily conduct. When morning broke over the trail, she now mounted Shadow with an innate sense of belonging, rather than an anxious negotiation with the massive beast. The way her fingers gripped the leather reins was firm and authoritative. When Theron or the guards posed a question, she answered them directly, entirely abandoning the submissive habit of softening her vocabulary to gauge whether her thoughts were acceptable to her superiors. Her laughter came frequently now, echoing through the wilderness. She took up her rightful space around the campfire, no longer hovering on the perimeter. And she stopped offering preemptive apologies before voicing her tactical opinions. Theron observed every single shift, maintaining a protective silence. He understood that a newly ignited flame was an incredibly fragile thing. The wrong type of attention, even well-intentioned, could easily smother the spark instead of sheltering it. He simply modified his own royal conduct to accommodate her growth, intentionally creating space for her autonomy without drawing any overt attention to his actions. Their daily riding tutorials had evolved into a natural, rhythmic routine without either of them uttering a formal agreement. What had begun as a matter of structural necessity, as Arya's self-taught form was highly inefficient and bound to exhaust her over the grueling northern distances, had transformed into a shared sanctuary. Theron had offered a minor correction regarding her posture on the first day, and she had absorbed the critique without a shred of resentment. The following afternoon, he adjusted the alignment of her shoulders. She asked a brilliant tactical question. He provided an exhaustive answer. Within a week, the lessons became the anchor of their journey. Theron would ride alongside her, occasionally reaching out with his large, leather-gloved hand to gently correct the angle of her wrist or guide the positioning of her heel against Shadow's flank. The ancient stallion endured these constant adjustments with an immense, uncharacteristic patience, his ears forward in absolute contentment.
Yet highly unusual occurrences had been manifest for far longer than the Alpha King was willing to consciously admit. As they navigated a vast, wind-swept stretch of high-altitude moorland on the 6th day following the confrontation at the way station, Theron began to meticulously catalog the anomalies. A bitter, unrelenting wind swept down from the northern peaks, carrying the piercing chill unique to the high mountains. Arya had fallen into a deep, reflective silence, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon as she processed some internal thought. Shadow perceived her shift in emotion before Theron's own likened senses could register it. The stallion's head snapped upward, his ears pinning back, not in aggression, but in hyper-focused concentration, tracking an invisible alteration in the air. The beast altered his powerful stride, drifting closer to Arya's side, his massive body angling protectively around her in a manner so subtle it appeared accidental, though Theron knew it was entirely deliberate. Arya remained completely oblivious to the horse's maneuvers, still lost within the labyrinth of her own mind. Theron tracked the animal's behavior in silence. This was the 4th distinct occurrence he had witnessed. The first had occurred when a royal messenger brought word that the Iron Veil Pack had formally registered a desperate, angry grievance with the High Council regarding her departure. Arya had kept her facial features entirely serene and her voice perfectly steady as the decree was read. Yet, before she could even process the news consciously, Shadow had stepped forward, pressing his warm muzzle firmly against her shoulder, offering an physical anchor of loyalty. The second instance had taken place at a smaller outpost, when an arrogant traveling merchant named Barrett had made a derogatory, unprompted remark regarding the propriety of an unmated, disabled Omega traveling with an elite royal escort. Before Theron could even draw his blade, Shadow had shifted his massive bulk, positioning his muscular frame directly between Arya and Barrett with the absolute, unyielding authority of an iron fortress gate, forcing the merchant to flee in terror. But there were 2 other occurrences that troubled Theron far more than he cared to admit to his council. Twice, when younger, unmarried wolves within his royal guard had spoken with Arya for an extended period, making her laugh or capturing her undivided attention, Theron's inner lichen wolf had surged forward with a vicious, territorial ferocity so primal and possessive it had required his absolute willpower to suppress the beast. He had desperately tried to rationalize the reaction as a standard monarchical duty to protect a vulnerable guest under his roof. He was rapidly losing faith in that convenient lie. Drav pulled the king aside during the late afternoon while the party paused to water the mounts at a wide, fast-moving river crossing. Drav was the most senior commander within the royal escort, a weathered, battle-scarred veteran who possessed a blunt, uncompromising honesty that Theron tolerated because it had saved his life across a dozen campaigns. Drav was an old soldier who had long since ceased to be awed by royal titles, having witnessed firsthand the immense blood cost that authority demanded. He waited until they had walked 10 paces away from the rest of the warriors.
"There is a critical matter we must discuss, my Alpha," Drav stated, his voice low and steady. "Speak your mind," Theron replied, his eyes fixed on the rushing water.
Drav looked at his sovereign with absolute seriousness.
"I have watched your physical reactions to 3 separate warriors attempting to converse with the Omega over the last 48 hours. Each time, within 30 seconds of them engaging her, your inner wolf begins pushing against your skin, demanding dominance. You masked the reaction expertly from the men, but you cannot mask it from me. I am fully aware of my own internal responses, Commander, Theron said, his tone tightening. I do not doubt your awareness, Your Majesty, Drav countered, his voice remaining perfectly even. I am simply telling you that I have witnessed that exact hyper-possessive spiritual reaction only once before in my 40 years of service. It was 12 winters ago, exhibited by your 3rd Sector Commander, Aldrich, 3 days before he recognized his fated mate. He had absolutely no comprehension of the magic overtaking his soul either. The river roared past them, cold and relentless over the dark stones. Mind your designated assignment, Drav, Theron commanded, his voice dropping into a freezing register. I obey, my Alpha, Drav replied, bowing his head respectfully, without a single indication that he found the king's denial convincing. He turned on his heel and walked back to his horse. That night, Theron sat alone in the darkness, far outside the warm perimeter of the camp's firelight, long after the rest of his warriors had surrendered to sleep. The hearth had decayed into a bed of glowing red coals. The ancient forest around them was profoundly still, wrapped in a heavy silence. Near the edge of the camp, Shadow stood vigil at his customary post, directly beside Arya's bedroll. A living shadow among the darkness, unmoving yet entirely alert. Theron stared into the dying embers, his mind forced to confront memories and desires he had spent 15 winters systematically burying. He had closed that particular door of his heart a lifetime ago, deliberately, practically, and entirely without self-pity. A monarch's existence was strictly engineered in ways that left personal happiness and romantic fulfillment permanently out of reach. He had balanced his accounts, accepted the isolation of the crown, and marched forward into the cold. He had been entirely comfortable with the solitary reality of his life. But Drav's heavy words now sat in his chest like an anvil. Shadow had recognized the truth from the very first instant. The ancient stallion had known the reality of her soul in that dark, abusive stable in the Ironvale territory, while Theron was still 3 entire kingdoms away, completely oblivious to the cosmic shift occurring in the universe. The Alpha King stared into the dying ashes of the fire for a very long time, his golden eyes unblinking in the dark. He did not sleep a single wink. Theron dispatched a high-priority royal scroll to the pack's oldest seer 3 days before their party was scheduled to breach the outer gates of Blackwood Keep. The message was incredibly brief, requesting a completely private, unrecorded audience in the royal chambers immediately upon his arrival. He provided absolutely no context for the meeting, which the wise matron would immediately recognize as an omen of immense gravity. The Alpha King did not demand private consultations for matters that could be processed through standard bureaucratic channels. There were perhaps 4 individuals in the entirety of the Northern Territories whose spiritual judgment Theron trusted without reservation. And the elderly seer had sat at the absolute pinnacle of that list since he was a prince of 19 winters. She was waiting patiently within the small, stone-walled antechamber adjacent to the main throne room when he finally arrived. Seated gracefully beside a narrow, arrow-slit window, her aged hands wrapped around a steaming earthenware mug of herbal tea, She looked precisely as she had for decades, unhurried, profoundly observant. Like a mystic who had foreseen this exact conversation years ago and had simply been waiting for the king's schedule to catch up with destiny.
Theron closed the heavy oak door, locking out the noise of the keep.
He remained standing on his feet, a lifelong habit that cleared his mind and allowed him to analyze threats with absolute precision. He required absolute mental clarity for what he was about to confess. He laid out the spiritual data in the exact chronological order of its occurrence, presenting the facts with the clinical detachedness of a military intelligence report. He detailed Shadow's unprecedented submissive behavior at the southern stables. He cataloged the immediate, intense protective instincts that had consumed him since her rescue. He confessed his inner wolf's violent, territorial reactions to any male wolves approaching her perimeter. Finally, he reported Drav's precise observations at the river crossing. He delivered the entire narrative without adding any emotional weight or subjective interpretation. When he finally finished his recitation, the elder matron looked up at him over the rim of her steaming cup, her dark eyes piercing. "Is that a genuine question, my alpha?" she asked softly. "Or are you merely presenting an equation?" "I require your absolute, unfiltered assessment of the situation," Theron demanded. "My true assessment," she replied, setting her cup down on the stone table with a soft click, "is that your intellect already comprehends the answer perfectly. You have traveled to this room simply because your stubborn pride demands an external confirmation, hoping that hearing the truth from my lips will make accepting your destiny feel less like a choice you made alone." Theron met her gaze, his iron jaw tightening. "You are not mistaken," he admitted quietly. The seer was 83 winters old, her hair a striking cascade of silver white, her ancient eyes possessing a profound depth that had seen through his grandfather, his father, and had navigated Theron through 3 bloody succession crises, 2 territorial wars, and more structural catastrophes than the royal archives could hold. Absolutely nothing under the heavens surprised her. "I understood the reality of the situation within a single hour of hearing the initial report regarding the stallion," she revealed. "Shadow has functioned as the absolute spiritual mirror of your inner lichen wolf since the day you bonded his soul. He recognizes what your beast recognizes, routinely faster than your conscious mind can process it. The horse discovered her first because his soul was actively paying attention to the universe, while your royal duties kept you blind." "I was not physically present in that kingdom," Theron countered, his voice defensive. "I was 3 territories away." "Your human flesh was distant," the matron stated plainly, entirely unmoved by his logic. "But your lichen wolf was not. Distance possesses absolutely no power to interrupt a true mate bond in its nascent stages. It merely makes the spiritual resonance more difficult for a rational mind to identify. Look at the facts you have just brought me. The fierce protective urgency, the uncharacteristic restlessness of your beast, the absolute profound peace that settles over your entire soul the moment she is near your person. Magnus, you have been describing the ancient, sacred mate bond for 20 minutes. You have simply been exhausting your vocabulary, using other words to avoid saying it." The stone antechamber fell into a suffocating, absolute silence. Outside the narrow window, the bustling courtyard of Blackwood Keep was fully visible, gray stone under a sweeping northern sky, populated by ordinary citizens and soldiers going about the routine work of survival. Theron stood before the weight of this cosmic revelation, the way he stood before all massive, life-altering crises. He turned the information over in his mind, aggressively examining every single angle, searching desperately for any logical flaw, any alternative explanation, or any evidence of confirmation bias applied to a series of strange coincidences. He found absolutely none. That absolute lack of an alternative explanation, more than any mystical word the seer had spoken, was what finally anchored the truth within his soul. He walked for hours after leaving her presence, pacing through the subterranean corridors of the keep, out through the massive eastern portcullis, and along the isolated outer battlements, where the mountain wind slammed against the granite walls with a deafening roar. There was no one on the high walls to observe the Alpha King thinking. He had always performed his most honest, terrifying introspections in constant motion, surrounded by freezing air, in spaces where the crushing weight of the great throne hall, the council table, and the accumulated expectations of 15 winters of absolute rule could be temporarily set aside. He had closed the door on the concept of a mate a long time ago, and he had done so without bitterness. He wanted to ensure he was being completely honest with his own soul about that fact. It had not been an act of resentment, nor the tragic aching of a lonely ruler who believed the universe owed him a companion. It had been a cold, practical accounting of his life. He was the Alpha King of the North. The crown demanded absolute sacrifice. The years demanded blood. He had paid every single debt without a whisper of complaint, building a powerful, secure empire from the ashes of war. Yet now, a disabled, abused Omega woman from the south had shattered his calculations without even trying. And the universe was demanding he open that door once more. The stone-walled corridors of the northern royal fortress held a silence that had once brought comfort to King Theron. But that comfort had grown entirely hollow. For over a decade, the Alpha King had ruled the frozen expanse alone, accepting a solitary existence as the price of his crown. He had long since dismissed the notion of a fated mate, treating it as an architectural detail left out of his life's design. Yet now, the disabled Omega woman who had arrived under his protection had completely dismantled his rigid calculations. Arya had endured a lifetime of being evaluated and discarded by those who viewed her only as a liability. Ronan, her entitled former betrothed, had ruthlessly rejected her before his entire pack, treating her broken body as a source of shame rather than offering the protection an Omega deserved. When she had fled in despair, ready to throw herself into the dark abyss of the border ravine, Theron had intervened. He had wrapped her shivering form in his heavy royal mantle, offering her sanctuary not out of a forced mate bond, but out of absolute, unyielding choice. He had declared her his protected royal sister, establishing a bond of found family that defied the traditional laws of the wolves. Yet, as Theron walked the high parapets of Blackwood Keep in the biting evening air, he faced a complex dilemma. The deep, ancient magic of the world had recently revealed a truth he had not anticipated. Arya was, in fact, his fated mate. The realization weighed heavily on his mind as the cold wind whipped against his face.
He understood with perfect clarity the danger of how he delivered this truth. Arya had spent her existence being managed, assigned, and spoken for by dominant wolves who used her compliance for their own convenience. If he simply approached her and declared that destiny had bound them together, she would not hear a declaration of devotion. She would only hear another powerful alpha dictating her future, stripping away the autonomy she had nearly died to achieve. Theron spent 3 full days deliberating, carefully selecting his words to ensure they conveyed reverence rather than command. He chose the quiet stillness of the evening to speak with her, a time when the daily duties of the court had subsided and the great hearth fire cast long, dancing shadows across the private chamber. Arya was seated in her customary chair near the warmth of the flames, her gaze fixed on the middle distance. Nearby, Shadow, the massive black stallion who had aided her escape and refused all other handlers, rested his heavy head against the stable gate, his dark eyes watchful. When Theron crossed the room and sat opposite her, Arya looked up, sensing the gravity in his posture. He did not use the tone of a sovereign. He spoke with the raw honesty of a man stepping into the unknown. He confessed the truth of the fated bond directly, watching as initial shock crossed her delicate features, followed by a brief, unguarded moment of wonder. But just as quickly as the light appeared in her eyes, a heavy wall descended. Her expression withdrew into a quiet, distant composure. She asked him a single, level question. She asked if he would have ever sought her out if Shadow had not chosen her, or if she had simply been another nameless runaway wolf from the southern pack. Theron, committed to absolute honesty, admitted he could not know what a different reality would have brought. But he affirmed that what he felt for her in the present was entirely absolute. Arya looked into the dying embers of the hearth, her voice carrying the soft finality of someone who had already braced for disappointment. She told him that he deserved a partner who was chosen freely, not an Omega assigned to him by a supernatural decree that neither of them had requested. She refused to be an obligation that happened to him, noting that her entire life had been defined by arrangements that suited everyone but herself. She offered him her gratitude, calling him a noble leader, before withdrawing to her quarters. Before the first light of dawn broke over the castle walls, Arya was gone. Theron was awakened not by the palace guards, but by the distressed sounds of Shadow. The majestic stallion was pacing frantically in a tight circle, striking the stone courtyard with an irregular, agitated rhythm. A low, pained sound escaped the beast, a cry Theron had never heard from him in all their years together. The Alpha King found Arya's quarters completely empty, her meager belongings gone. Her exit executed with the practiced stealth of someone accustomed to disappearing without a trace. The bond registered her absence like a spreading physical wound, each passing moment clarifying the depth of his miscalculation. He had given her the space to withdraw, allowing her to believe she was a burden to be managed. Shadow pressed his large nose firmly against Theron's shoulder, urging him forward. With a focused, deadly intensity, the Alpha King resolved that he would not lose her again. 2 hours south of the northern border, inside the common room of a secluded way station, Ronan and his gray-robed pack elders finally cornered her. Arya had barely settled into the modest refuge when the sound of heavy hoofbeats signaled the arrival of her past. Looking through the frost-rimmed window, she saw Ronan standing in the courtyard.
flanked by his elite guards and 2 legal representatives of the Iron Veil Pack.
He did not look angry. He looked prepared, armed with the rigid protocols of pack law that held immense weight outside Theron's immediate territory.
Inside the dimly lit room, the elders laid out the formal documents of the original mating agreement. Reading the terms with the mechanical neutrality of an unfeeling system, Arya sat with her hands flat against the wooden table, listening to the machinery of an order that had never left room for an Omega's refusal. Ronan leaned across the table, his tone smooth and deceptive, claiming he had not come to inflict punishment, but merely to bring his property home. He was a male, entirely incapable of understanding that Arya's life was not his to govern. Arya straightened her posture, looking directly past Ronan toward the senior elder. With an unwavering voice that cut through the tension of the room, she invoked the right of refusal under Northern Territory law, specifically citing Article 9 of the Ancestral Compact. She noted that her residence within the northern borderlands granted her provisional standing, rendering the Southern Pack agreements completely null and void due to the absolute lack of freely given consent. She demanded that her words be recorded exactly as spoken. Before Ronan could unleash his fury, the heavy timber door of the way station swung open. King Theron entered the room, his towering presence immediately shifting the atmospheric pressure of the space. The guards went rigid, and the elders instinctively bowed their heads. Theron did not position himself in front of Arya as a barrier. Instead, he stepped directly to her side, his shoulder parallel to hers, establishing an unbreakable front. The Alpha King announced that the Northern Crown officially recognized and enforced Arya's invocation of Article 9. He informed Ronan that all legal avenues were permanently closed, and that any attempt to breach her sovereignty would be treated as an act of war against the kingdom. Ronan stared at the monarch, realizing the absolute finality of his defeat. With his pride utterly shattered, the arrogant Beta rose slowly, straightened his heavy coat, and retreated through the door without looking back. Later that afternoon, as the golden sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees, Theron and Arya rested near a slow-moving creek outside the village borders. Shadow grazed contentedly nearby, the long journey finally behind them. Sitting on the grass, the Alpha King did not speak of ancient prophecies, pack laws, or fated obligations. Instead, he spoke of the profound loneliness of a throne room built to make ordinary men feel small, and how her defiant spirit had brought life back into his silent world. He told her that he had fallen in love with her sharp mind, her fierce protectiveness over his stallion, and the shaking yet resolute voice she used to defend her freedom. He explained that the fated bond had not created his devotion. It had merely arrived late to explain a truth that his heart had already recognized. Arya looked out over the ripples of the creek, realizing that for the very first time in her existence, a powerful alpha was making room for her rather than taking it away. She turned to face him, her eyes completely clear. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and placed her hand in his. Theron's fingers closed around hers without hesitation, a perfect alignment of two souls who had fought through the dark to find their own dawn. Under the patient gaze of the great black stallion, the afternoon light held them in a quiet, unhurried peace. Their future no longer dictated by destiny, but chosen freely by their own accord.